Remember Arkansas left for the SEC a long, long time ago, right? And then you had a little bit of a trickle effect. Penn State goes to the Big Ten. And then really when the motherlode began, and correct me if I'm wrong, is when in 2010, I'm driving back to Tyler after interviewing with a job here in Waco, and reports all over the place that Nebraska and maybe Colorado would be leaving. There was even Missouri in that mix, whatever. So Nebraska's leaving for the Big Ten. So how did that happen? How did we get here? Today, The Athletic wrote an article about this, and here are some quotes from former Nebraska football coach, more known for what he did as a coach, but not as an AD, but he was there for a while, Tom Osborn. Of course, we, Nebraska, participated in the move, they're talking about the Big Ten, to the Big Ten, and that was due to primarily, now read this here, to the fact the South Division of the Big 12 had entered into an agreement in principle with the Pac-10 conference. The rest of his comment. We didn't know anything about it in the North Division. It appeared to be done until the Pac-10 demanded the rights to all of the TV revenue, and Texas was looking at the Longhorn Network, which of course came about when they had their great run and almost won another national title, and they weren't willing to give that up, and that broke the deal. One more comment from Osborn. That whole period of time was very difficult for the Big 12, and it was precipitated largely by that failed attempt by the South Division of the Big 12 to join the Pac-10. I remember that back then. It looked like Oklahoma and Texas, and maybe Texas Tech, among others, were headed out west. It was either a power play or it was either gambling or whatever, poker. But in the end, the Longhorn Network was the reason why Texas, and again, I'm not in the middle of those meetings. Deloss Dodds was a part of this article as well. I have a quote from him on Something Else College Football. But I did not know, I knew that there was negotiation, but I did not know that it was absolutely just the South Division and the North Division was left out of any of that conversation, but of course they did find out.
Well, we were told that the reason, that was the rumor was, Stanford and Cal didn't want a religious school like Baylor, or they didn't want to, the politics in Texas and the politics in California are different, and they didn't want to, deal with those things and all kind of things to that nature. But ultimately, if what Tom Osborn says is true, and I have no reason to believe that he would have worse information than anyone else, and that's what he believed as the AD at Nebraska at the time, was that the Longhorn Network undid it, which is not surprising. And we knew about that, at least in Texas, joining the Pac-10 was never going to happen, or Pac-12 at the time, or I guess it's Pac-10 then, that it wasn't going to happen because Texas didn't want to give up the Longhorn Network. Reading through this column, it was kind of surprising to me that Deloss Dodds says these really, gives you all these great details and then pretends like he was on the outside looking in of that when he was the dude who was stirring the entire pot. That was always kind of weird to me about how he presents it. But yeah, that would have been wild had that actually gone through. And it is crazy to think that a channel that no one watched for a decade, unless you were a super dyed-in-the-wool Texas fan, has caused so much upheaval in college athletics.
Yeah, it's been a year of reflecting on the Big 12's history, that's for sure. I think we've seen every little caveat, every little niche story, every little realignment piece possible on the Big 12 at this point. That chapter could have gone very differently, as you pointed out, and we wouldn't be talking about whatever we're talking about right now the way we're talking about it had that happened. It would be a wildly different looking college football scene. Texas wouldn't be going to the SEC, or maybe they would after 10 years in the Pac or whatever. Oklahoma State, Texas Tech obviously were supposed to be a part of that. I know Baylor was not supposed to be a part of that ultimately, or, I feel like something probably would have prohibited them. I don't think they were a part of that package. Wasn't it Oklahoma State, Tech, and Texas? Wasn't that the main?
Seemed like it,
yeah. Baylor would have been left out in the cold, probably having to go join the American or something like that, and align themselves more along SMU, TCU probably same thing. West Virginia, who knows where they'd end up and what conference they would be a part of. So you could go up and down the league, and it would have been wildly different for everybody. So that's what could have happened but didn't, and here we are, and that's part of the reason why we are here is because that did not go through the way that it was initially planned. But yeah, it'd be a wildly different looking world had those four joined the Pac-12 back in the day. And, are UCLA and USC joining the Big Ten if that was the case? I don't know. Is the SEC still calling for OU in Texas? I don't know. Like, those are a lot of questions. We'll just never know. And, in hindsight, for all four of those schools, perhaps, that would have been better off for them, or perhaps, that not going through ended up being the better thing so that they all landed where they eventually did. Time will tell on that, but it is fascinating to go back and look at what could have happened and how that would change what we're looking at right now.
All right, so one more quote in this article from Deloss Dodds, who was the Alpha AD for Texas. He also was at Kansas State before that. But he was asked about the future of college football. Money, and this is not breaking news, but money will always dictate things. But it seems to me, this is from the former AD at Texas, who always mentioned that UT was, that we are the Joneses, because he could. And they were. And in some ways, they still have that clout financially and with the eyeballs and all the other stuff, too, except just not enough success in football. Maybe that's about to change. But here's someone that understood the value of Texas and was a part of perhaps bolting, was a part of negotiating the Longhorn Network, which made a ton of money for UT, and they got blamed for it all, even though ESPN's the one that offered the money. Money will always dictate things. But it seems to me if there was an NFL type packaging TV rights altogether, it would probably generate a lot more money and do a better job of putting people in geographical regions. In other words, what he's saying is, remember, back in the early 80s, the NCAA lost control of the television money, and eventually it went to the conferences in the individual schools. What he was saying is, if they negotiated as a whole, like the NFL does, then you could have some sort of, this is the kind of money you're going to earn, but that's never, I can't imagine that's ever going to happen unless we do get a couple of those super conferences and they move forward.
Well, unless, and there's got to be different leadership in college athletics or a different financial long-term goal, which would be like a czar of college football, which would mean breaking college football off from everything else and treating it like the different entity that it is. Like right now, it's governed by the same rules that track and field is, and it brings in, thousands times the money that track and field does. But it's governed and treated the same way by the oversight organization, which is the NCAA. So that would have to change. Like look, Deloss Dodds is a brilliant athletic director and a true mover and shaker, and maybe the greatest athletic director ever when it came to growing his brand and growing his school. So I think people should kind of mine him for ideas. I do think it's funny that he kind of left out, or they left it out in the article. Maybe he didn't answer it, but he didn't really respond to Tom Osborn's, part of that story at all, which is funny. And he was like, yeah, well, it was a bummer to lose Nebraska and A&M. That kind of hurt. Well, like, they did that because of you, man.
Yeah, I'd like them to get Deloss and Osborn into, it would have been nice to see like them getting them into a room and like, what's the real story there? Because if you hear it from the Nebraska point of view, it's different than hearing it from the Texas point of view. It's like, it's Nebraska's fault. They're dang scholarships for walk-ons, and then on the Texas side, it was a Longhorn Network, and it was. It's a he said, or she said a situation anytime that particular chapter gets brought up. So I don't know. I believe a little of column A, a little of column B, but it would be nice to just get that whole story out there. And maybe somebody's done a deep dive on that. I don't know, and I've just missed out on it. But there is always that like underlying tension of still who was at fault, for what all ended up happening. And I don't think that'll ever go away between Nebraska and Texas. But yeah, it's interesting to look back on. It has, little to no bearing on now. And as far as this comment goes, that sounds all nice, but I don't think that we're actually moving towards where the Auburns, the Alabamas, the UTs and OUs now, or the USCs, the Michigans, the Ohio States are wanting to, help Sam Houston State thrive, or help, Iowa State be at the top of their game. I think we've gone the opposite direction of that, if anything. And so to change that back to where it's back to geography and making sense in one big old grand TV deal that satisfies everybody, I see no indications that that's anywhere in the realm of realistic. So, yeah, it sounds nice. It'd be nice for probably college football fans as a whole, but it seems like the most far-flung thing that could probably happen at this moment.
All right, 3